The show was live, audience, cameras, and millions watching. The critic didn't talk about the music, didn't talk about the career. He laughed at Elvis, questioned his appearance, his voice, and said in a mocking tone that he was no longer relevant. The studio became uncomfortable. Some laughed nervously. They expected Elvis to react with anger or to stand up and leave. But the response he gave, calm, polite, and unexpected, made the critic lose control and made many people at home rethink what strength really is. The studio lights of The Mike Douglas Show burned hot that afternoon in 1973. It was one of those talk shows that dominated daytime television, the kind where celebrities came to promote projects, share stories, and occasionally face challenging questions that made for good ratings. Elvis Presley sat in the guest chair, wearing one of his signature jumpsuits, white with gold embellishments, the kind that had become his trademark in the Las Vegas years. At 38 years old, he was no longer the young rebel who had scandalized America with hip movements and dangerous rock and roll. But he was still Elvis, still the king. The show's format was known for bringing in multiple guests who would discuss topics, sometimes debate, occasionally clash. It wasn't confrontational by design, but host Mike Douglas had learned that a little tension made for compelling television that kept viewers from changing the channel. The other guest that day was Harold Jennings, a music critic from a major New York publication. Jennings had built his reputation on sharp, unforgiving reviews. He was the kind of critic who believed his job was to puncture egos, to tell uncomfortable truths that fans were too starstruck to see. His columns were read widely, quoted often, and feared by many in the entertainment industry. The interview had started cordially enough. Douglas asked Elvis about his recent tour, about his connection with audiences, about what kept him motivated after so many years in the business. Elvis answered with his characteristic politeness, that southern gentility that never seemed forced or calculated. He spoke about gratitude for his fans, about the privilege of performing, about how music had given him everything. The studio audience, mostly women ranging from housewives to young professionals who had taken long lunch breaks to attend the taping, responded warmly. They applauded at appropriate moments. Some gazed at Elvis with admiration that bordered on reverence. Even after all these years, even with the weight he'd gained and the toll that fame had taken, he still commanded presence that few could match. Harold Jennings sat quietly during this portion of the interview, waiting. He had notes on the small pad he carried, questions he'd prepared, observations he was eager to share. His expression was patient, but carried hint of smugness, the look of someone who believes they're about to say something important, something that will cut through the pleasantries and get to real truth. The cameras captured everything. Close-ups of Elvis's face when he smiled, wide shots of the studio audience, occasional cuts to Jennings, who shifted in his seat, clearly ready for his moment. Mike Douglas, experienced host that he was, could sense the dynamic. He'd done this long enough to recognize when one guest was coiled like spring, waiting to release. He'd invited Jennings specifically because he knew the critic had strong opinions about Elvis's recent work, about the direction of his career, strong opinions made for good television. "Harold," Douglas said, turning to the critic with practiced smoothness, "you've been covering music for 20 years. You've written about everyone from Sinatra to the Beatles. What's your take on Elvis's current place in the music landscape?" The question was professionally phrased, but everyone in the studio understood what it really meant. Here's your opportunity. Say what you came to say. Jennings leaned forward, accepting the invitation with barely concealed eagerness. He glanced at Elvis, not with respect, but with something closer to pity mixed with contempt. Then he looked directly at the camera, addressing not just the studio audience, but the millions watching at home. "Well, Mike," he began, his voice carrying that particular tone of superiority that critics sometimes mistake for intelligence, "I think we need to have an honest conversation about relevance, about what happens when an artist's time has passed, but they don't have the self-awareness to recognize it. The studio audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the polite disagreement they'd expected. This was something sharper, more personal. Elvis remained still in his chair, his expression neutral, his hands folded calmly in his lap. He didn't interrupt, didn't react, just listened as the critic continued. "I mean, look at him!" Jennings gestured toward Elvis with wave that managed to be dismissive. "The jumpsuits, the Vegas shows, the same songs over and over. Is this really what the king of rock and roll has become?" And that's when everyone realized this wasn't going to be an interview. It was going to be an execution. Harold Jennings wasn't finished. In fact, he was just getting started. He had spent 20 years as a music critic, sharpening his ability to dissect, to analyze, to find weakness and expose it under harsh light. And now he had one of the biggest stages imaginable. Live television, millions of viewers, and Elvis Presley sitting 3 feet away from him. "Let me be specific," Jennings continued, settling deeper into his chair with confidence of someone who believed he was performing public service. "Elvis, when was the last time you recorded something truly innovative? Something that wasn't just recycling the formula that worked 15 years ago?" He didn't wait for an answer. The question had been rhetorical, designed to wound rather than elicit response. "The jumpsuits," Jennings gestured again at Elvis's outfit, his hand moving in circular motion as if trying to encompass the absurdity of it all. "They're so over the top that they've become parody of themselves. You look like you're trying too hard to be relevant, trying to manufacture spectacle because the music alone isn't enough anymore." A nervous laugh rippled through parts of the studio audience. It was the kind of laughter that comes not from genuine amusement, but from discomfort, from not knowing how else to react when witnessing someone being openly attacked. Other audience members remained silent, clearly uncomfortable, but uncertain whether they should defend Elvis or stay quiet. Mike Douglas shifted in his seat, sensing that this was going further than he'd anticipated. "Harold, that seems a bit—" "No, Mike, let me finish," Jennings interrupted, raising his hand. "This is exactly the kind of honest conversation we need to have. Elvis represents everything that's wrong with the music industry right now, living off past glory, refusing to evolve, playing to crowds who want nostalgia instead of artistry." He turned directly toward Elvis now, abandoning any pretense of talking about him rather than to him. "Tell me, Elvis, and I'm genuinely curious, do you ever look at what's happening in music today? At artists like David Bowie, who are actually pushing boundaries, taking risks, creating something new? Don't you feel even slightly embarrassed standing on stage in Las Vegas, doing the same routine you've done 1,000 times, singing songs that were already old when Nixon was elected?" The sarcasm in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't criticism meant to be constructive. This was demolition disguised as intellectual discourse. "Your voice," Jennings continued, really warming to his subject now. "Has anyone told you what's happened to it? The recordings from your early years, those had power, rawness, danger. Now you sound like you're doing Elvis impersonation. You're doing karaoke of yourself." More uncomfortable laughter from the audience, though notably less than before. People were beginning to realize this had crossed line from provocative interview into something crueler. Elvis sat through it all without interruption. His posture remained relaxed, his hands still folded in his lap. His face showed no anger, no defensiveness, no hurt, at least none that was visible to the cameras capturing his every expression. He simply listened, his eyes on Jennings, giving the critic his complete attention, as if this were normal conversation rather than character assassination. "And your fans," Jennings pressed on, clearly emboldened by Elvis's silence. "The people who still come to see you, they're living in the past too, aren't they? They're not coming for new music or fresh perspectives. They're coming to remember when you were actually important, when you actually mattered to popular culture. He leaned back, satisfied with the thoroughness of his critique. So my question, Elvis, is simple. Don't you think it's time to gracefully step aside, to acknowledge that your moment has passed, that continuing to perform at this level is less about art and more about ego? The studio had gone completely quiet now. Even the nervous laughter had died. The audience seemed frozen, unsure whether they'd just witnessed brave truth-telling or gratuitous cruelty. Mike Douglas looked at Elvis, concern evident on his face. Elvis, would you like to respond to that? Elvis uncrossed his legs slowly and leaned forward slightly. Not aggressively. There was nothing threatening in his movement. He was simply preparing to speak, taking his time, refusing to be rushed into reaction by the weight of the silence or the harshness of the criticism. He looked at Harold Jennings for a long moment. Not with anger, not with hurt, just looked at him, really seeing him, in a way that made the critic shift uncomfortably for the first time since he'd started talking. Then Elvis spoke, his voice soft but clear enough for every microphone to catch. Well, first off, I want to thank you for your honesty. The studio audience gasped slightly. That wasn't the response anyone had expected. Elvis let the words, "Thank you for your honesty," hang in the air for a moment before continuing. His tone wasn't sarcastic, it wasn't defensive, it was genuinely gracious, as if Jennings had offered constructive feedback rather than delivered verbal assault. "I mean that," Elvis continued, his southern accent carrying warmth that seemed incongruous with the tension in the studio. "I appreciate when people tell me what they really think, even when it's hard to hear, maybe especially when it's hard to hear." Harold Jennings blinked, clearly thrown off balance. He had prepared for anger, defensiveness, maybe even for Elvis to walk off the set. He hadn't prepared for gratitude. "You asked about relevance," Elvis said, settling back into his chair with same relaxed posture he'd maintained throughout the attack. "And that's a fair question. Am I as relevant today as I was in 1956? Probably not. The world's changed. Music's changed. I've changed too." He paused, choosing his words carefully, not because he was calculating a response, but because he genuinely wanted to communicate clearly. "You mentioned David Bowie, great artist, doing things I could never do, and that's okay. Music isn't a competition where only one person gets to matter. There's room for what he does and what I do. There's room for all of it." Mike Douglas leaned forward slightly, sensing that something unexpected was unfolding. As for the jumpsuits, Elvis glanced down at his outfit with a small smile. "Yeah, they're over the top. That's kind of the point. When I'm on stage, I'm not trying to be subtle. I'm trying to give people a show, something bigger than everyday life. If that seems silly to some folks, I understand. But the people who come to see me, they seem to enjoy it." He turned his attention fully to Jennings now, his eyes meeting the critics with directness that wasn't confrontational, but wasn't avoidant either. "You said I'm doing karaoke of myself." That one stung a little, I'll admit. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. "But here's the thing. I've never claimed to be the same singer I was at 21. How could I be? I'm not 21 anymore. My voice has changed because I've changed. I've lived more, experienced more, lost more." The studio had gone completely silent. Even the crew members who normally moved around checking equipment had stopped to listen. "You asked when I last did something innovative," Elvis continued. "Fair point. I'm not trying to reinvent music. I never was, really. Even back in the 50s, I wasn't inventing anything new. I was just mixing things that already existed in ways that felt right to me. Black music, white music, gospel, country. I wasn't being innovative. I was being honest about what moved me." He shifted in his seat, and there was something in his posture now. Not defensiveness, but gentle firmness of someone who had found his footing in the conversation. "And that's what I'm still trying to do. Be honest with people. I get on that stage in Las Vegas and yeah, I sing songs I've sung before. But I sing them because they still mean something to me. Because the stories in those songs are still true. Because the emotions are still real. Elvis's voice remained steady, never rising, never taking on edge of anger or bitterness. You said my fans are living in the past. Maybe some are. But maybe some just want to hear music that reminds them of good times, of being young, of first loves and summer nights. Is that so terrible? Is there something wrong with giving people that? He leaned forward now, his expression earnest. You asked if I feel embarrassed. Honestly? No, I don't. I'm grateful. Grateful I can still get up there. Grateful people still want to come. Grateful I have the chance to do what I love. Elvis paused, then added with quiet dignity, I'm not perfect. Never claimed to be. My voice isn't what it was. My body isn't what it was. But I show up, I give what I have, and I try to be honest about it. He looked directly at Jennings and said something that would be quoted for decades afterward. You see failure where I see continuation. You see irrelevance where I see evolution, and that's okay. We're both entitled to our perspectives. Then Elvis did something that no one expected. He smiled, not a bitter smile, not a forced smile, a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes. Besides, he added with touch of humor that broke the tension slightly, if I'm doing karaoke of myself, at least I'm doing karaoke of someone who was pretty good to start with. A few people in the audience laughed, real laughter this time, not nervous discomfort. Elvis turned to Mike Douglas. That answer your question? The silence that followed Elvis's response was absolute. It was the kind of silence that rarely occurs on live television. No coughing, no shuffling, no ambient noise, just complete, heavy quiet as everyone in the studio processed what they'd just witnessed. Harold Jennings sat frozen in his chair, his mouth opened slightly as if to respond, then closed again. His prepared follow-ups, his clever retorts, all the sharp observations he'd been ready to deploy, none of them seemed to fit anymore. Elvis hadn't given him anything to attack, hadn't provided fuel for continued confrontation. The critic's face showed something that the cameras caught in uncomfortable detail, the realization that he'd miscalculated. He'd come prepared to demolish someone he assumed would be defensive or arrogant. Instead, he'd encountered grace, humility, and a kind of quiet strength that made his own aggression look petty by comparison. Mike Douglas, veteran of thousands of interviews, recognized the shift immediately. The dynamic in the studio had completely reversed. Moments ago, Jennings had been commanding the space with his criticism. Now he looked small, mean-spirited, like someone who had brought a knife to what he thought would be a fight and found himself facing someone who refused to fight at all. Well, Douglas said, clearing his throat and attempting to steer the conversation towards safer waters, I think that's a very thoughtful response, Elvis. Let's talk about your upcoming tour schedule. But before he could finish the redirect, something happened in the audience. A woman in the third row began to applaud. Just her at first. Slow, deliberate claps that echoed in the silent studio. Then another person joined. Then another. Within seconds, the entire studio audience was applauding. Not the polite, obligatory applause that guests typically receive, but something more emotional. Some people were wiping their eyes. Others were nodding with visible approval. The applause continued for nearly 30 seconds, which on live television feels like an eternity. The cameras captured it all. The audience's enthusiasm, Elvis's modest acknowledgement with a small wave, and most tellingly, Harold Jennings sitting rigid in his chair, his jaw clenched, clearly disturbed by how his attack had backfired. When the applause finally died down, Douglas tried again. Elvis, your tour? Actually, Jennings interrupted, his voice tight with barely controlled irritation. I think we should address something. Elvis just gave a very pretty speech about honesty and continuation, but he's avoiding the actual critique. The substance of what I said remains true. He's past his prime. His best work is behind him. There was audible gasp from the audience. The critic was doubling down, unwilling to accept that he'd lost control of the narrative. Elvis turned to look at Jennings again, and there was something different in his expression now. Not anger, still not anger, but perhaps a hint of sadness. Sadness for the critic, not for himself. "You're absolutely right," Elvis said quietly. "My best work might be behind me. But you know what? I'm okay with that. Not everyone gets to have a prime. Not everyone gets years of doing what they love. I've been blessed. If all I do from here on out is sing songs that remind people of better times, that's still more than most people get." Jennings opened his mouth to respond, but Douglas cut him off firmly this time. "I think we've explored this topic thoroughly, Harold. Let's move on." The rest of the interview proceeded with noticeably different energy. When other questions came, from Douglas, from the audience, they were respectful, even gentle. People asked about Elvis's favorite memories from his career, about his influences, about his hopes for the future. No one else attempted to attack or diminish him. Jennings sat through the remainder of the segment in visible discomfort, occasionally trying to insert sharp observations that fell flat in the changed atmosphere. Each attempt made him look more petulant, more like someone who couldn't accept that his moment had passed. Elvis answered every question with the same gracious patience he'd shown from the beginning. He told stories, laughed at appropriate moments, thanked people for their kind words. He never referenced Jennings's earlier attack, never gloated, never tried to make the critic look worse than he'd already made himself look. By the time the segment ended and they cut to commercial, everyone in that studio, crew, audience, even Mike Douglas himself, understood what had happened. They had witnessed a masterclass in dignity. They had watched someone choose grace over revenge, understanding over anger, kindness over cruelty. And they had seen in stark relief the difference between someone who had real strength and someone who merely had sharp words. Harold Jennings had come to prove Elvis was irrelevant. Instead, he'd proven exactly the opposite. The phones at the television station started ringing before the show even went to commercial break, viewers calling to express outrage, not at Elvis, but at Harold Jennings. Switchboard operators frantically scribbled messages as caller after caller demanded to know why the show had allowed a guest to be treated so disrespectfully. By the time the episode finished airing, the station had received over 300 calls. By the end of the day, that number had grown to thousands. Letters arrived in the following days. Not the typical fan mail, but something different. People writing to express what they'd witnessed, what it had meant to them, how Elvis's response had affected them personally. "I was going through a difficult time at work," wrote a teacher from Ohio. "People were criticizing me constantly, and I was ready to quit. Watching Elvis handle that critic with such grace gave me strength to face my own critics with dignity instead of anger. My teenage son has been bullied at school," another letter read. "We watched the show together. Afterward, he said, 'That's how I want to handle people who are mean to me. Thank you, Elvis, for showing him what real strength looks like.'" The media coverage was immediate and extensive. Entertainment columnists who had spent years critiquing Elvis found themselves writing about something entirely different, not about his music or his Vegas shows, but about his character. "What we witnessed on the Mike Douglas show wasn't just good television," wrote one columnist who had previously dismissed Elvis as past his prime. "It was a lesson in how to be human. Elvis Presley, criticized publicly and harshly, responded with a grace that should shame all of us who have ever met criticism with bitterness." Harold Jennings attempted to defend his approach in subsequent interviews. "I was just being honest," he told reporters. "Someone had to say what everyone was thinking." But the public response made it clear, whatever people had been thinking about Elvis's career, they hadn't been thinking he deserved to be humiliated on live television. And they certainly hadn't been thinking that someone who responded to humiliation with kindness was weak. In fact, the opposite message took hold. Editorial cartoons appeared showing Elvis as a figure of dignity, standing tall, while critics threw stones. Op-eds discussed the Elvis standard, responding to attack with grace rather than retaliation. Within weeks, the incident had become cultural touchstone. Johnny Carson referenced it in his monologue. "Did you see how Elvis handled that critic? Makes you wonder if kindness is the ultimate power move." Even other musicians, some of whom had privately questioned whether Elvis's best days were behind him, found themselves defending him publicly. "Say what you want about his music," said one contemporary artist in interview, "but the man showed us all how to handle criticism with class." The incident had another unexpected effect. It changed how people listened to Elvis's music. Songs they had heard 100 times suddenly carried new weight. "Are You Lonesome Tonight?" wasn't just a ballad anymore. It was sung by someone who had demonstrated profound emotional intelligence. "My Way" took on deeper meaning when performed by someone who had literally shown what it meant to maintain dignity while being attacked. Concert attendance increased, not just from nostalgic fans, but from younger people who had heard about the television incident and wanted to see for themselves what kind of person could respond to cruelty with such grace. Harold Jennings' career, meanwhile, took different trajectory. His criticism became known less for its insight and more for its cruelty. Editors started rejecting his harsher pieces. "We don't want to be associated with that style anymore," one told him. Within 2 years, he had left music criticism entirely. But the story didn't end with Jennings's professional decline. It lived on as something bigger, something more important than one critic's failed attempt at a takedown. Teachers used the clip in classes about conflict resolution. "Notice," they would tell students, "how Elvis never lowered himself to the critic's level. He didn't fight fire with fire. He fought fire with water. He cooled the situation instead of inflaming it." Corporate trainers showed the clip in seminars about handling difficult personalities. Churches used it in sermons about turning the other cheek. Parents showed it to children being bullied. The incident was remembered decades later, not as the time a critic attacked Elvis, but as the time Elvis demonstrated that true strength isn't about how hard you can hit back. It's about maintaining your dignity when someone tries to take it from you. It became a perfect encapsulation of who Elvis had always been. Someone who, despite fame and wealth and adoration, never forgot what it felt like to be looked down on, never stopped treating people with kindness, never confused cruelty with honesty. The lesson was simple but profound. When someone tries to diminish you, you don't become smaller to accommodate their attack. You become bigger by refusing to fight on their terms. Elvis had shown the world that gentleness in the face of cruelty isn't weakness. It's the highest form of strength there is.